Welcome to episode 6 of the yield pyramid. As you'll see, today we are completing the second tier of our yield pyramid, and we're going to be talking about sulfur and zinc. Now let's go ahead and start off with sulfur. Sulfur is what we call a secondary nutrient. So even though it's not needed in the same amounts as, say, like our macronutrients such as phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen, our secondary nutrients are still very important and oftentimes are overlooked when it comes to maximizing our crop yields and return on investment. Sulfur is used in processes like photosynthesis, chlorophyll production, seed production, nitrogen utilization, and important for nodulation in our legume crops in soybeans and alfalfa. Now, sulfur is immobile in the plant, which means that the deficiency symptoms are going to show up in the new growth of our plants versus the old ones. So when it comes to, say, like nitrogen, potassium, we usually see those deficiency symptoms show up in the lower leaves, where immobile nutrients such as sulfur are going to show up in the new leaf development. And you can see from the picture there, a lot of times in the, if you want to call it the crotch of that corn plant, you can see the typical sulfur nutrient deficiency symptomology. Now, from the road, sulfur deficiency may look like it's just short on nitrogen, because oftentimes plants are an off yellow color. But the thing that really separates out sulfur deficiency, as you can see, is the interveinal chlorosis. So we'll have a green stripe, yellow stripe, green stripe, etc., as we move on down through. Now, these deficiency symptoms often show up in the springtime when the soils are cold. And because of that, we see that because our organic matter in our soil is a great source of sulfur. And in cold weather, that organic matter is not breaking down until the soil warms up and the microbial activity accelerates. So typically we can see that we can get about 2 pounds of sulfur per percent organic matter. Now, our crops here in northeast Iowa, whether it's alfalfa, corn, or soybeans, generally take up anywhere between 25 to 35 pounds of sulfur. So you can kind of start to do some math based off of your soil test and see where your organic matter levels are at. And typically we find in our rate response trials that if we apply 15 to 20 pounds of actual sulfur, we usually can do a good job of maximizing our yield and our return on investment on that sulfur fertilizer. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is, like nitrogen, sulfur is leachable. So this means that each year we're going to have to replenish our sulfur to some extent because of what we can lose during the growing season, especially some of the wet growing seasons that we've had in the past. Now, because sulfur is leachable, that also means that our soil test can be very erratic when it comes to determining how much we have there and if we need to apply more. So if we need to do any in-season analysis, oftentimes we recommend that you use a tissue test to determine if we need supplemental sulfur. What we have found, though, through our research is darn near every year we do need to be applying sulfur, whether it's to corn, soybeans, or alfalfa. So just kind of, if you can, get it into your crop nutrient budget for every growing season. Now, the only time that we may recommend more than 20 units of nitrogen is when we have sandy soils. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, obviously, there's not much organic matter in sandy soils. And then the other thing is water percolates down through sandy soils much more quickly. So we know that we can, whatever sulfur that may not have been used up by the crop to date, can be lost quite easily through that sandy soil. Now, planter applied sulfur in a 2x2 or even dribbling it behind the closing wheel, which a lot of people are doing right now, is a great place for sulfur. We get that banding efficiency that we've talked about with other nutrients. The liquid form that we're using is called ammonium thiosulfate, or ATS. And then for those of you that might be banding in like a strip till, are probably using the dry product called ammonium sulfate. But again, the banding efficiencies that we gain are just night and day difference between doing a banded application of sulfur versus a broadcast. Now, if you are doing broadcast, this can still work, and we recommend using the AMS or the ammonium sulfate, the dry, and that can be mixed in with, say, your potash or phosphate that you spread in the fall or in the spring. But just keep in mind that because we are broadcasting it and not concentrating it near the plant, we probably have to up our rate just a little bit to ensure that that early corn growth has ample sulfur. Now, the yield response is usually typically there when it comes to sulfur, but the other thing that we see, especially in corn, is that accelerated early growth that sulfur brings us. We oftentimes can reach pollination and then therefore black layer 3 to 5 days earlier than if we're deficient on sulfur. So a lot of times our economic analysis doesn't always just include the yield benefit from sulfur, but also generally we see nearly year in, year out on corn that we are 1 to maybe 2 points drier in the fall where we've had ample levels of sulfur versus the strip next to it that may have been sulfur deficient. Now, some people ask, what about elemental sulfur? Oftentimes it's a very inexpensive way to get our sulfur on. The one thing that we found out with elemental sulfur over the years is that it can take up to 2 years or more for that elemental sulfur to become available. Now, if you are in, say, an alfalfa crop or something like that, and apply annually, we can get close to what we need with elemental sulfur, but one of the things that we found, especially in cold springs and the further north that we go, is our soils don't get warm enough soon enough to start breaking down that elemental sulfur to have it available, whether it's for corn, soybeans, or alfalfa. So we always encourage, even if you are using some elemental sulfur, that we still put in some AMS or some ATS for that quick early shot of sulfur in the spring. Now, there is some evidence that we should include some sulfur with our nitrogen applications, and it appears that there's some type of synergistic effect. We don't fully understand that, but it seems like anymore if we can include a little bit of sulfur with a nitrogen application, it just seems like we get a little bit more kick. So again, if you're putting on some UAN as a side dress or as a Y-drop application, throw in some ammonium thiosulfate, or if you're broadcasting some urea as a side dress, then throw in some AMS. Now, the last thing that I just wanted to show you how some of the responses that we see when it comes to sulfur is if you take a look at the photo. This here was actually a picture that I had taken after applying just some spray grade AMS before a rainfall to a local alfalfa field, and you can see here several weeks later the difference in growth, color, and also notice the difference in maturity. You can see we actually have some blooms on that alfalfa where we gave it some extra sulfur versus the check, which is essentially the rest of the field. So again, just keep in mind we really need to think about putting sulfur into our cropping system annually, whether it's corn, soybeans, or alfalfa. So let's move on to zinc. And zinc is the most commonly talked about and applied micronutrient, and for good reason. You can see there that zinc is important in a lot of different functions in our crops: protein production, hormone regulation, flower formation, germination and vigor, and we especially see in our zinc trials where we can enhance early root growth and development in the zinc versus the untreated check. So here in Iowa, our crops that we're growing generally take up about 1/2 pound of zinc per year. So obviously that's not a lot, but it's still important that we have it available to our growing crops. And the one thing that we have noticed for you livestock guys is zinc fertilizer applications can become more important when we start talking about a lot of manure applications. And it seems like high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus actually may limit the uptake of zinc. So typically where we see these high phosphorus levels from years and years of manure application is where we kind of break away from the recommended soil test levels. Now, zinc is a positively charged nutrient, so it's held tightly to our soil. So it's not one that we like to just broadcast and leave on top. If you could broadcast it and incorporate it throughout the soil profile, because it doesn't move much, the roots are actually going to have to probably intercept most of it. But because we're applying such a small amount of zinc, we find once again that planter applications, especially a 2x2 application, because we are getting it in the soil, is very, very efficient. So studies have shown that 1 unit of zinc or 1 pound of zinc in a 2x2 is equivalent to 10 units or 10 pounds of zinc broadcasted and incorporated. So you can see there once again the efficiencies of banding our nutrients with the planter, especially when they're a non-mobile nutrient like zinc. Now, the soil test level recommendations have actually been calibrated quite well here in the state of Iowa, so we need to compliment Iowa State University for doing research on that. And generally we find that about 3 part per million on your soil test should get you pretty darn close to maximizing yield. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is most laboratories will not have zinc as a standard soil test result, so you'll probably have to ask for that or move up to the next level in the soil test result request in order to get that. And again, when we look at having very high levels of phosphorus because of manure application, there's some evidence that maybe we need to have a 10-to-1 ratio when it comes to phosphorus and zinc. So as you remember earlier, we kind of talked about having your soil test level in that 30 to 50 part per million on phosphorus. Well, if you take 10-to-1 ratio, that 3 part per million zinc that we just talked about kind of fits right in. So for some of you guys that may have 90, 100 part per million on your phosphorus levels, we should probably be shooting for closer to 10 part per million on our zinc soil test. Now, we don't usually see zinc deficiency out in the countryside. There is a picture here that kind of shows what zinc deficiency will look like. But to be honest with you, in my 20-some years of walking fields, I've never seen a zinc deficiency, but I have had fertilizer trials where we have gotten a yield response from zinc. So that tells us that the plant could be significantly deficient in zinc before we actually see any symptomology. So be sure to take those soil tests, and then also if you're at this level of the pyramid and trying to finish off this last block on the second level, probably some tissue tests would also be very beneficial in that kind of situation. So this completes the first 2 tiers of our pyramid, and with some respectable soil and a decent growing season from Mother Nature, if you have the bottom 2 tiers completed, there is no reason why we can't expect and shoot for 250 plus bushel per acre field averages when it comes to completing the second layer of the yield pyramid. So really encourage you guys, again, to pull out those soil test levels, think about what you're doing with your nitrogen and your sulfur, as those are the leachable nutrients that don't show up real well on your soil test. And if we can complete these 2 levels in the pyramid, you will see that you will have consistent high yielding crops. If you have any questions on anything covered today, be sure to contact your local Pioneer sales representative. From all of us here at Pioneer, thank you for your business. Be safe, and we'll see you in the fields.
That concludes this Pioneer Agronomy video podcast. Visit our page on pioneer.com and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for more agronomy insights.